Hi, this is Joseph Johnson with Ultimate Athlete Concepts. Um, for many years, we've supplied books in the field of sports science for, I guess, over 20 years now from some of the great scientists. And in the last several years, we've lost quite a few of them. Obviously, Dr. Veroshansky in 2009, but more recently, Dr. Michael Yessis about 2 years ago, so it's 2023. Also, Vladimir Asurin, right in that same time frame. And most recently, Dr. Anatoly Bondarchuk, as of this recording, was about a little over a month ago. So, with that in mind, I felt like it made a lot of sense to maybe revisit and emphasize and try to preserve some of the principles that the great scientists, left us with, and to make sure that they don't get lost or bastardized as a lot of different uh, things in the field have gotten in some ways. So, one of the things that I wanted to talk about initially in this first iteration is the idea of specialized exercises. This is something that's gotten a lot of debate, a lot of criticism, probably in the United States. And I think it's interesting that it's warranted in some hands, and then on other hands, I think people have thrown the baby out with the bathwater and not looked at this or looked at it from its intended purpose. So specialization, you know, in exercise or training began in the Soviet Union, and it probably got legs, I would say, probably in the 1970s is where it really became more a part of the system. Might have, been before that, but really started to become part of what was going on. And that increased quite a bit. So in the 70s, the athletes training, was probably 80-20, general to specialized. In the 1980s, it was the opposite. And so they were recognizing that general strength training, had an effect. It was a positive effect, but then it had a very much declining return to margin. It as years went on, it became less and less valuable to getting better results in the actual sport. So, with that in mind, I wanted to kind of touch on how did that evolve and where did it come from, and why is there so much debate on it or confusion? I think it's more really what it is. So I think what you need to distinguish between two things: specialized exercises for sport training, and what it's been termed sport specific training are two different things. So in the United States, you hear a lot about sport specific training. This kind of gained legs, I don't know, maybe 10, 20 years ago, somewhere in that ballpark, maybe longer. And this is where people who were not qualified were looking at ways of making a sport theoretically training an aspect of a sport action that did not adhere to the rules of specialized training, and they were done by people who just really didn't have that qualification to determine that. And I think this is where things kind of started to go off the rails, because then what we found was a lot of bastardization, misinterpretation, and you know I think it resulted in exercises that were not only not applicable, but in some cases maybe injurious. So I wanted to go back and review what the rules are, and then kind of look at what the where the debate lies. So I think one thing that's easy to see is that with this sport specific training, and I think you see this a lot in the ball games that we play: basketball, football, baseball, that kind of stuff, where people are using implements in ways that don't make sense. They don't have any scientific basis, and more importantly, they don't have any transfer onto the sport. And then you have other people who say, well, you can't use specialized exercises, let's say, for example, in running, because they'll give different reasons of saying, well, you can't approximate the forces that occur in sprinting, for example, or it won't carry over once, especially with a higher level athlete, it won't carry over once they get onto the track or whatever the case is, as far as the sport that they compete in. I think running is kind of universal because it's involved in all the sports. So I'm going to kind of make reference a little bit more to that in this talk, because that way, it covers, it occurs in every sport. Hockey, obviously skating is a little bit different, but the general idea and principles are still in play. So, you know, so one of the examples was like in running, does hip flexion and extension, does that play a role? How does it play a role? And what should the rules be on that? So what I want to do is I want to, and before I go too deep into this, this is for the practitioner. I'm not talking to the scientist. I'm not a scientist. I'm not an expert. My background is simply being mentored by an expert and other experts, having the incredible fortune to be mentored by Dr. Michael Yessis and be at the nexus of Dr. Vereshchansky, Dr. Bondarchuk, Dr. Isurin, being able to, being their publisher, being able to learn from them, as well as Hank Kreienhoff, too, he's still here, thank God, and learn from these guys who are far more capable than I am. But I think it does help that I can, because I was able to kind of, I had access to them, essentially when I wanted, and I could ask the questions. I had a unique experience that I think can be valuable for other people. And I'm mainly speaking to, the coach, the athlete, and the scientist too, I guess, because I'm just not quoting a bunch of studies and stuff like that. That's just not my area. I try to stay in my lane and talk about what I know. So we want to establish real quickly, this has been talked about before, but I want to establish it real quickly just so that we know what we're talking about. So dynamic correspondence was a law, the laws of dynamic correspondence, I should say, was established by Dr. Vereshchansky, talking about exercises that would meet this qualification of dynamic correspondence, which was, very specific exercises. And let me say this too, we're not talking sport specific, we're talking skill specific. And I think this is an important distinction that needs to be made, and it allows for you to kind of distinguish, between, what we're talking about here. And the other thing is that I don't think specialized exercises are something that someone can just pull out of their butt, or you see it on Instagram or whatever. You really need someone who has a biomechanical background, who can establish the principles for a specific skill and the biomechanics that are involved, so that you can decide how to train them and each individual skill, because it's not going to be the whole skill every time. In fact, that's going to be pretty rare. But nonetheless, dynamic correspondence, the rules are, the exercises have to be the amplitude and direction of movement of the skill. So it's got to kind of duplicate that, right? And the accentuated region of force production. This means that, example with running, I'll use hip flexion. It's easy. They talk about the region of force production. Most of the force production with hip flexion for running is developed when the leg is behind the body, especially when it's the furthest behind the body. That's going to be probably the most important. By the time the leg meets the other leg as it's coming through and goes beyond that, it's riding momentum, and this is not necessary. So you see people who are using hip flexor exercises where they're raising the knee up high. It's not. It's fine to help develop the hip flexors, but it's not developing through the accentuated region of force production, and it's going to have minimal effect on running efficiency and also power production. Uh, and then also the dynamics of the effort is number three. This is, like how does it happen when they're playing? And it's not going to duplicate it exactly, but it needs to be in the ballpark. The rate and time of force production, and the regime of muscular work. So that could be like we're talking about concentric, eccentric. We might be doing something where we're doing an overcoming isometric. It could also be done as a non-contact plyo. It could also be used as in more modern language velocity for power, where you're using a lighter load and going much faster. So this defines what is dynamic correspondence. Now, does that mean that every exercise that you call specialized would adhere to these rules? No. What it means is that is the collective of rules that would qualify as perfectly corresponding. And that would be the tip of the spear for someone where you're leading up to that. You'd like to be able to do that if you can. Now, actions sometimes like in football or basketball are unpredictable, whereas pitching in baseball can be very predictable, and you can, really cement that action in and really duplicate something. And I'll talk about that in a moment. And then along comes Dr. Bondarchuk, and he talks about this as well. Now, he's talking about levels or grades of specialization. And he divided into 5 different categories, and I'll read them in so that we have some kind of idea of what he was talking about. General exercises do not have direct correlation to anything, except if it's a really lower level athlete, and it doesn't improve sports performance. So this is like we're just developing the body. Younger ages, maybe in a very general cycle for someone who's a little more advanced. I don't like talking about high-level athletes or real advanced athletes because I don't think we have that many in the United States. So I think that's kind of been a little bit of a misnomer to say that. Then we have general preparatory exercises. They don't repeat the actions that have positive influence onto the actual sporting action. So the first one could have been like, a long jog for somebody who plays hockey. It's not going to have a direct correlation, an indirect, but not a direct one. A general prep could be something that could involve, a little bit more specific, but not quite. I'm trying to think of a good example there would be maybe some calisthenics, possibly something like that, where you're doing a few things that are taxing the body in an overall way, but they're not going to repeat anything. Then special prep exercises use similar muscle groups. So, like I just mentioned, hip flexor exercise, you could be doing the exercise where you're bringing the thigh up high from the straight position, where the leg's right underneath you. That would qualify as that. It doesn't duplicate the action, but it does use similar muscle groups. Then special development, and I think this is where a lot of it is really going to reside, is it repeats the skill in separate parts. So you could have, running obviously you're not going to be able to do the whole thing at once, right? But what you can do is you could work on the push-off. You could work on the knee drive or the hip flexion, or you could work on the hip extension or pull back, those portions of the actions. And then you could do the competitive exercise, which is the 5th level, which is, this is really dynamic correspondence, essentially, maybe not identically, but close. And that's identical technique in easier or more difficult conditions. So this would be in throwing heavier and lighter implements, like in the hammer throw. Dr. Bondarchuk used heavier and lighter implements in the hammer as part of the training on a very regular basis. If you were a baseball player, for example, let's say a baseball pitcher, you'd use a ball. Normal ball is 5 ounces, so you might use a ball that's 6 ounces, 7 ounces, 4 ounces. The 6 and 7 ounces, and maybe up to 8 ounces, would allow for more intense firing of the motor neurons, because they're kind of faked out by the heavier weight, but not enough and you got to remember this, it cannot be enough additional resistance where it changes technique. This is touched upon by Dr. Michael Yessis. Not touched upon, he really kind of went over that a lot. It's touched upon by Dr. Vladimir Zetsyorsky as well in his book Science and Practice. You know, you have to be really careful there with how much it's changed. And then the 4-ounce ball would be for speed of contraction. And so you would use them in different sequences to allow for better performance in pitching. I want to make a special offer to those who are following along with the videos that we're creating. So we have a code, Stronger20, to give you a 20% discount on any purchases. You just need to put in the code at the purchase page of Stronger20. It'll be Stronger, the word, and 20. And we'll give you a 20% discount on anything you order. And if you're international and you're ordering multiple books, please reach out. We'll try to get that shipping down as low as possible, and discounts for multiple books. So just let us know if you're interested in something like that, and I'll get back to you and see what we can do for you. Thanks for watching. We really appreciate it and hope to hear from you. Lastly, you could also, and this could be done in quite a few sports where you use heavier and lighter not heavier and lighter, but heavier like weighted clothing, and you take it off so it's lighter. So you might, let's say, for example, if you're playing basketball, you might play, a game with weighted shorts on and weights around the lower leg. And when you do that, same idea. The musculature's firing in a different way, more intensely, and then you take them off, take the shorts off, like maybe halfway through, and now the body's moving in a much lighter state than it doesn't realize the shorts came off. Now the contraction's much faster, and so now you're starting to see a greater transfer onto the actual sporting movement when they're playing. And what's the beauty of weighted clothing is that it's doing exactly what the sport is, and which is very hard. Like to create exercises around everything that happens in the sport is impossible, I would say. But the weighted clothing allows you to really kind of do that, duplicate that. And one of the other ones that I think is interesting too, that should be mentioned, is you see like resisted running, like sleds. There's a 1080p, I think they call it. Which is real sophisticated, where they can load the body real specifically for resisted running. And what's going on there, though, this is something that Dr. Zetsyorsky mentions in his book, was that even the way that you attach the implement can really matter. So you don't want to attach it around the waist, because then you can start to bend at the waist and change technique too much, so that some of the transfer is dampened. Whereas what he suggests, what Dr. Yessis has suggested, and I'm sure other ones have too, is to make sure that the resistance is around the center of gravity. This allows for the best transfer, because now you're not changing technique as much. And you also, there's rules in there too about how much should that resistance be, how much should it be if you're doing overspeed training. And there's different rules. I don't want to go too deep into that, but there's different rules if it's like for the first 10 meters, or if it's for the, like speed, top speed, different, there's different formulas there. And, you can read about those in other texts. So with that in mind, what we want to try to think about, number one is, don't try to create your own specialized exercises, because you might be close, but you might be really wrong, and it may not be transferring, and you could be wasting your time. I would rely on material that's already been put out for the most part, especially like with running. I think it's pretty easy to do that. You can find material. Interestingly, like with the hip flexion, I looked into Dr. Zetsyorsky's book and Dr. Veroshansky's book and Dr. Yessis' books, all describing the same thing. The exercises were done a little bit differently. I think they were more primitive with Veroshansky and Zetsyorsky's book, because this was back, during the Soviet Union. It hadn't evolved as fully yet. And then Dr. Yessis came along and said, okay, let's see if we can get this a little bit better and duplicate it, because he started out with the more primitive versions, and then as time went on, he said, okay, let's put this in a different posture, if you will, and so it allowed for even better carryover, and it also allowed for better progressions and everything else, in my opinion. And those exercises can be done not just in one way, not just with the concentric or the eccentric accentuated, or, you could do this with, flywheel, where, it's concentric, it's being resisted, being pulled back quite a bit with the concentric. It can be done with, like an overcoming isometric to develop more explosiveness when you do the movement. Do it in a velocity way. You can do it as a non-contact plyo. So there's a lot of different applications there. And then lastly, like I guess the ultimate with it would be, weighted clothing. I think would probably be the best duplication. Where there's very little loss there in translation or carryover. And knowing how to do that, you want to learn how much weight should be on there. How long should you wear it? I would say in a general sense, they don't have to be worn terribly long. I would say, if you're playing a game, maybe 10 minutes, and then you can take them off and then play more. Or if you're running, depending on how many sprints you have planned for that practice. And just as an aside, hopefully not a lot. Don't go crazy. It's not necessary. And you could have workouts where you only wear the shorts, and then you could have workouts where you wear them half the time and then you take them off. Or you could use a running chute where you tear it off halfway. You could use a running sled where you tear it off halfway. And if you're one of those people who has access to a 1080p, which is pretty rare, from what I understand, I think you can change the resistance at different points. Don't quote me on that because I might be wrong. Point being, there's a lot there. So why do we talk about this? The reason why is because general exercises are great and they produce a good result. In Dr. Zeciorski's book, Science of Practice, he mentions that, in the first year of training, you might increase your squat by 100 pounds and you have a corresponding increase in vertical jump of, let's say, 4 to 6 inches. The second year, you could increase the squat by another 100 pounds and it doesn't improve at all. So that's kind of confounding with all the people who say that all you need to do is get stronger generally and you'll become a better athlete. It's obviously not true. You don't need to be a scientist to realize that powerlifters aren't very good athletes in any way, shape, or form. They might be worse athletes than they were in the beginning, to be honest. So if that's the case, then we don't want to, labor that. And one of the best examples of this is Dr. Bondarchuk in Transfer Training. He outlines, his study, which was 7,000 athletes over 20 years, where he sent out questionnaires asking their performance in a variety of exercises and lifts and their corresponding personal bests in their sport. What he found was a couple of things. One was he found that there seemed to be upper limits on general strength exercises correlating back to better performance. So he looked at him and he said, okay, all these people who are world class, none of them are stronger than this point, and they all kind of seem to be kind of grouped. There's not a big disparity here between them, and no one is way stronger that's performing better. And that's the whole point, is to perform better, right? As we say, or as I've said before on the podcast, the biggest issue is to get the check cut, right? If they're not winning, an Olympic medal, scholarship, or getting a paycheck, it really doesn't matter. So that's what we want to keep our focus on. So he used an example that I think was really great. Yuri Sadiq was his star pupil. He had trained him for a number of years. I think it was like 12 to 15 years. I think he had gotten him as a teenager. And with these questionnaires, he was able to put this information together, compared those numbers with Yuri Sadiq, who in 1986 broke the world record by ways, and it's still the world record, and that is now actually 40 years ago. Uh, what he showed was that was really interesting was that in none of the exercises and in none of the lifts or like vertical jump tests or anything like this, he wasn't the best. In fact, in a lot of ways, he was not even close to being the best. But he wasn't the best in any of the measurements, what other people might call a KPI. He wasn't the best at any of those things. What was interesting, though, is that he was the world record holder. So he was better at throwing the hammer than everybody. But he was also better than everyone in the world at throwing the heavier and lighter hammers. I think this is what really makes the big distinction, is that as time went on, Dr. Bondarchuk, realized what really matters is, can he throw the implement further in practice with these other, levels of implements that have higher transfer onto the actual sport. And I think that's really critical, right? Because no one sniffed the world record since then in 40 years. He in his production with Olympic medals is unprecedented. Every time he went to the Olympics, he won every medal, and that happened over the 70s and the 80s. He was also a world record holder himself. In fact, in 76, he was the bronze medalist, and his pupils were the gold and silver. So he trained the number one and number two, and he was the bronze medalist himself. So that speaks to his acumen as a coach. I mean, he literally was unprecedented. There's never been anyone like him. And I think he thought very practically, though, as a coach. He was a PhD, but he thought as a coach. He always came back to what's the performance? This has to transfer. It has to equate to a better performance. If it doesn't, then it doesn't make sense. So I think that the thing to take away here is, does strength matter? General strength? Yeah. It matters. And I also think what matters is the way you develop it. I don't think that you need really high intensity methods to develop it. It doesn't need to be a 1RM. In fact, Dr. Bondarchuk stated that 80% was probably the max that you should be developing strength in. He said maybe a small percentage of the year for a high-level athlete to work above that, and he said in anything lower than a high-level athlete should never be a part of their year. So keep that in mind too. You really, he advocated ranging, from 60% maybe up to 80%, and maybe sometimes even lower. In younger, like if you have younger kids, even lower than that. That was the best range to develop general strength or specific strength on the percentage. And then the degrees of specificity started to become more and more part of the picture as you go on. As we all know, if you take a lower level athlete or a new athlete, let's say they don't need to be like young, they're just new, low training age, pretty much anything you do will work. But then if you've worked with anybody for any length of time, that stops being the case, stops working. So what we want to do is find ways that we can, improve, keep the improvement going without having to load them constantly. And anyway, that'll become a net negative anyway. There's a point where it stops, and then there's a point where it's a negative. And the other nice thing with specialized exercises, and I'll use running again, is that if they're done correctly and they're done at a low intensity, they actually help perfect running technique. As you duplicate what should happen, we've seen this over and over again where the running technique improved without us doing anything else, like working on it specifically. The exercises actually help do it. And I can tell you that in a practical way, and I want to say this is probably 15 plus years ago, a coach from Western Michigan University came up to see me and wanted to kind of follow us around. And he was introduced to specialized exercises, and he thought, he wanted to see, because it was kind of a newer idea. So he brought it back to Western. He was working with girls soccer. I think he did a 6-week kind of like little study of his own. And they only did specialized exercises for 6 weeks. Came back, and I believe it was 0.15. It was 0.13 to 5, I think, improvement in 40 times in 6 weeks of using specialized exercises only. So this speaks to the efficacy. Obviously, there's something to that, right? And the idea that like the prime movers are the quads, and that's true. But why? But the hip flexors are involved too, and the extensors. And why not train them? And then why not train them in the way that they contract when you do run? Having an imbalance between everything doesn't seem to make sense because obviously, you know, chain's as strong as its weakest link. So if there's something to be gained there by training the other musculature in the specific way that it contracts, I think it makes a lot of sense. It's not an either or. It's just it's additive. You want to bring that in because it adds another dimension and it adds improvement. So I think that kind of proves, or I don't want to say totally proves, but it bolsters the case, that you could use these exercises in this way and it will add dimension. And I've had many, other anecdotes from many, many different coaches over the years. And one of my absolute favorite coaches, Jay DeMayo, he's over at the University of Richmond, strength coach for basketball. Dear friend of mine, a brother to me, who I love. But he, at first, when we first talked about this kind of stuff, he's like, I don't know, which is natural. And then he started to use them. To his credit, he was willing to give it a shot. And when they did, he saw their improvement. Now you can see him on YouTube. He's been, or on, Instagram and other outlets, displaying how these are done and how they implement them. And this is, many years after the fact, at least 15 plus years after the fact. And they're an integral part. And other schools as well. When I helped with Michigan Tech basketball, we used them, and football, and we used them to real great effect and got really good results. And many other instances where this has happened. So I think that it's something that you should look at. If you're working with athletes, for more than a year or so, it's going to become less and less of an issue of their general strength and more, not that you won't train that, but there's going to be like this marginal rate of improvement is going to go down. And what if you bring in some specialized exercises in there to up that efficiency again, and your marginal rate of improvement improves? I'm hyper competitive. I want to win at everything. So to me, I want to look at every possible way of milking more improvement out of the athlete that I'm training. So I think it's backed scientifically. There's no question. Vereshchansky, Zagorski, Yesis, Bondarchuk, Issarin, and then the great Dr. Donskoy, who was a biomechanist in the Soviet Union, all are very much advocates of this. And I really can't think of any of the great coaches who weren't advocates of this. So anyone who disagrees in America, I think, does it on very faulty ground, because I don't think there's anyone in the United States who has the acumen to disprove it, or the qualifications to disprove it. I think that's pretty safe to say. And so I think it's definitely not been disproven by any stretch. And I think there's a lot of compelling evidence that it works. And lastly, it's like, what do you got to lose? It's an extra 15, 20 minutes a couple times a week. See what happens. It's not going to hurt anything. So if you want more information on this, Dr. Yesis, a couple of his books were good. Explosive Running, Biomechanics and Kinesiology of Exercise. Dr. Bondarchuk's Transfer Training goes into this. Dr. Vereshchansky's Super Training and Special Strength Training Coaches Manual touches on it as well. So you have some different things there. And then Dr. Zagorski's book, Science of Practice of Strength Training, goes into this as well. And I think they're all good, valuable pieces there. If you have questions about it, you can email us at info@ultimateathleteconcepts.com, and or we're on Instagram and on we have a YouTube channel, Facebook, so you can message me that way, and I would be happy to answer questions to the best of my ability and time constraint. So thanks for listening. I hope this is valuable for you, and please throw any questions our way or comment. Appreciate the feedback. Thank you and have a great night.